I know how this sounds. I've rehearsed it 100 times, in the shower, in the dark, in the parking garage at work where I sometimes sit in my car for 20 minutes before I can make myself go inside. I've tried to find the version that makes me sound sane. I haven't found it yet. But I'm telling it anyway because staying quiet has started to feel like its own kind of danger. It began the way most disasters do, quietly and with the best intentions. I moved into the Caldwell Street apartment in early March, the kind of gray, featureless month that makes everything feel provisional. The building was a converted Victorian, high ceilings, original hardwood, radiators that ticked and groaned like old men waking up. My unit was on the 3rd floor, the top. Number 9. The landlord, a compact, soft-spoken man named Gerald Hess, told me I'd love it up there. You can hear everything from the top floor, he said, and smiled as though that was a selling point. I was 31 and newly alone. Not dramatically alone, no devastating breakup, no death in the family, nothing with clean narrative edges. My last relationship had simply dissolved, the way things do when two people gradually run out of reasons to stay. I'd been renting a room in a shared house for 8 months, and the privacy of my own place felt not just appealing but necessary. A matter of basic psychological hygiene. The apartment was beautiful in a worn, honest way. The floors had grooves worn into them near the kitchen sink and the window seat, evidence of lives arranged differently than mine, people with different habits, different preoccupations. I found that comforting. I unpacked my books first, then my kitchen, then my clothes in that order, which is how I've always unpacked, and which tells you something about who I am. By the first evening I had a glass of wine on the window seat, and the city below looked manageable, and I thought, this is going to be fine. This is exactly what I needed. I want you to remember that. I want you to understand that I was not, at that point, someone with a history of anxiety or paranoia or dissociation, or any of the other words that have since been offered to me. I slept well. I had friends I saw regularly. I exercised. I ate vegetables. I was, by every available measure, a person with their feet on the ground. The first month was uneventful in the best possible way. I learned the apartment's vocabulary, the specific way the kitchen faucet needed to be turned to stop its dripping, the 3rd step from the bottom of the staircase that let out a sound like a small animal in pain, the pattern of light through the bedroom window at 6 in the morning that could pass, in half-sleep, for someone standing in the doorway. I made coffee each morning. I went to work. I came home. I read. I met my neighbor sometime in April. She lived in Unit 7, directly below me. Her name was Mara, and she introduced herself on the landing in that slightly formal way of people who live alone and have had to relearn small social protocols. She was perhaps 45, with a kind of face that had clearly once been striking and still was, in a quieter way. She worked from home doing something with contracts. She was vague about it, and I didn't push. She brought me a small plant as a welcome gift. A pothose, she said, because they're hard to kill. I put it on the kitchen windowsill and promptly forgot about it, which is relevant only because of what I noticed later. Mara was pleasant in the way that slightly lonely people sometimes are, attentive in a way that felt genuine but occasionally landed at the wrong frequency. She remembered things I'd mentioned in passing, the name of a colleague I'd complained about, a book I'd said I was reading, a specific kind of tea I'd mentioned liking. When she referenced these things weeks later, I felt, each time, a small jolt of something I couldn't name. Not discomfort, exactly. Something adjacent to it. We got into the habit of occasional evenings. A glass of wine in her apartment or mine, conversation that ranged easily across books and cities we'd lived in, and the particular exhaustion of middle life. She never overstayed. She never pushed for more than I offered. She was, I told myself, exactly the kind of low-key friendship my new life needed. Someone near, but not intrusive. Company, without obligation. The first thing I noticed, and I call it the first thing, though I wonder sometimes if it was, or just the first thing I registered, was the journal. I kept a journal. Nothing elaborate. A plain black notebook where I recorded the day's observations, occasionally a feeling or a dream. I'd kept one for years, and the habit was by then nearly unconscious. I wrote in it each evening before bed, usually 3 or 4 lines. I kept it in the drawer of my nightstand. In early May, I sat down to write and paged back through the previous week's entries, as I sometimes do, just to get a sense of continuity. And I found a gap. Not a missing page, nothing so obvious. Simply a date that skipped. Tuesday to Thursday, no Wednesday. I turned the pages forward and back several times. There was no entry for that Wednesday. I was not alarmed, not even unsettled, not immediately. I assumed I'd simply forgotten. It happens. I was tired. I'd been working long hours. I moved on. But the following week, the same thing happened. This time I found the gap earlier, on purpose, flipping back with something that was not yet suspicion, but was perhaps its embryonic form. This time it was a Monday. I had no memory of that Monday being unusual, no event I could recall that would have broken my routine. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time trying to reconstruct it, the way you try to reconstruct a dream you know you've had. Nothing came. I started double-dating my entries. I began writing not just the day but the specific time, and I started noting small verifiable facts, what I'd had for lunch, the weather, something I'd heard on the radio. An anchor system, I thought. A way of keeping my grip on the shape of time. I told myself I was being slightly neurotic and smiled about it, and didn't mention it to anyone. Around this time, I began to notice the sounds. The building had its own soundscape, as all buildings do, and I'd largely absorbed it. The radiator language, the creak of pipes, the muffled movements of the couple in Unit 4 who seemed to disagree about things regularly, though I could never make out the words. But there was a new element, or one I'd started hearing, which is not the same thing. A sound from below, from Mara's apartment, I was almost certain, that occurred at irregular intervals late at night. Not a voice, not music, a kind of low, rhythmic sound that I can only describe as purposeful, though that's not really a description at all. It was the quality of intent I noticed. It did not sound like someone moving through their evening. It sounded like someone doing a specific thing, with concentration. One night, I went to the kitchen for water at 2 a.m. and stood very still, and the sound was directly below my feet. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. The sound did not stop. When I went back to bed, it continued for some time, and I lay in the dark and felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature but from the space between knowing and not knowing. I didn't mention it to Mara. I don't know why, exactly. Partly politeness. Partly something else. The plant, I realized one morning, had been moved. This is such a small thing that I almost didn't include it, and then I decided it was essential. The pot hose had been on the left side of the kitchen windowsill, where I'd placed it in April. It was now on the right side. I had not moved it. I was certain enough of this to stand in the kitchen for a full minute trying to reconstruct some scenario in which I had moved it and forgotten. I watered it occasionally. I hadn't killed it, which surprised us both, I think, but I had no memory of shifting it, and I was meticulous about such things. I was not the kind of person who absently rearranges objects. I put it back on the left side. 3 days later, it was on the right again. I started taking photographs. My phone, each morning, a picture of the kitchen windowsill, a picture of my desk, a picture of the arrangement of items on my bathroom shelf. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself anyone would do the same. I did not examine too carefully the fact that I hadn't told anyone about any of this, not because I thought they'd disbelieve me, but because saying it aloud felt like a step I wasn't ready to take. The photographs, of course, confirmed it. Not dramatically. Not in the way that would have been easier to process. A book I hadn't moved. A mug on the wrong hook. The plant. Always the plant, patient and undeniable on the wrong side of the windowsill. I had a spare key. I'd left it with Mara. She'd offered to hold it in case I ever locked myself out, and I'd agreed because that was the reasonable, neighborly thing to do. It occurred to me to ask for it back. It occurred to me a number of times. Each time, some social calculus intervened. The awkwardness of it, the implied accusation, the fear of being wrong and having said the wrong thing to someone who lived 12 feet below me and had been nothing but kind. I rehearsed versions of the conversation. I did not have it. June arrived. The days lengthened, and the apartment filled with evening light in a way that should have been pleasant. I noticed that I'd started moving through the space differently, pausing at the doorway before entering rooms, scanning rather than walking. An alertness I hadn't had before. My jaw ached each morning from clenching it in sleep. I had dinner with Mara on a Thursday. She'd made something Italian and was in good spirits, and being there was both a relief and, underneath the relief, something close to unbearable. I watched her move through her kitchen with practiced ease and tried to detect. What? Guilt? Awareness? I didn't know what I was looking for. She seemed, as always, genuinely glad of my company. We talked about a book we'd both read years ago. We agreed on the ending. As I was leaving, she said, without particular emphasis, "You should sleep more. You look a little lost." I thanked her and went upstairs and sat on the floor of my bedroom for a while. Here is the thing about this kind of suspicion. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the force of conviction. It seeps. It finds the small cracks in your certainty, the places where you've said to yourself, "I don't know," or "maybe I'm wrong," or "I've been stressed lately," and it pools there, cold and patient. And because it doesn't announce itself, because it has no face, you can't confront it or reason with it. You can only watch it accumulate. I started sleeping badly. Not dramatically, no nightmares, nothing cinematic. Just a new lightness to it, a quality of surveillance even in rest. I would surface from sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning with a specific feeling of having been watched, and I would lie very still and listen to the building breathe and hear nothing wrong, nothing, and that made it worse rather than better. I reviewed the photographs every few days. The sequence was incontrovertible. Things moved. Small things always, and with a consistency that ruled out coincidence but not, technically, my own unconscious action. I was not sleepwalking. I was certain of that. I had no history of it. But I'd started to feel uncertain about the certainty, which is its own particular horror. My journal entries from this period, I've read them since, with the specific discomfort of recognizing yourself in a version you no longer are, have a quality I can only describe as careful. I was measuring my words. I was writing in a way that accounted for the possibility that someone else might read them. I didn't realize I was doing this until much later. One Saturday, I came home from the grocery store and unlocked my door and knew immediately, before I could have articulated any specific evidence, that someone had been in the apartment. The knowledge was physical, a change in the air pressure, some residue of presence that might have been real or might have been the projection of weeks of accumulated dread. I stood in the doorway and made myself breathe steadily and looked at the room. The plant was on the right side. I'd moved it back 3 days ago. I'd photographed it in its correct position. I put the groceries down on the floor and sat in the kitchen for an hour. I didn't call anyone. I don't fully know why. Part of me was still so afraid of being wrong, of having a plausible explanation produced, and being forced to live with having made an accusation, or worse, with the knowledge that my own mind was doing this to me. Part of me, if I'm honest, was afraid that saying it aloud would make it real in a new and more permanent way. But I went downstairs that evening. I knocked on Mara's door. She answered in a cardigan, a book in her hand, and the warm, ordinary backdrop of her apartment behind her. She looked unsurprised to see me, which I noted. Asked for the key back. I said I'd had a friend offer to hold it instead, which was a lie, and delivered it as smoothly as I'd practiced it. She looked at me for a moment. Something crossed her face, too fast to name with any certainty. Then she smiled and said, of course, no problem at all. She'd get it. She went to her kitchen, and I stood in the doorway, and when she came back, she pressed the key into my palm and said, "You seemed like you needed more space." I thanked her. I went back upstairs. I locked the door and stood in the kitchen and held the key and could not stop thinking about the phrasing. You seemed like you needed more space. Not, you can always let me know, or just say if things get too busy. Something about the past tense of it. Something about the word seemed. There are people who will tell you that what happened next was the product of an anxious mind, and they may be right, and I have turned this over so many times that the surface of the question has gone smooth. But here is what happened. I went through my journal more carefully. All of it from March, from the beginning. I was looking for the Wednesday entry I'd lost in May. I was looking for the Monday. And I found something I hadn't looked for. Entries that did not sound like me. They were close. They were close enough that I'd read through them without hesitation, weeks ago. Same handwriting, same shorthand, same idiom. But reading carefully, reading forensically, with the cold attention of someone who no longer trusted the ground underfoot, they were not quite mine. The rhythm was slightly different. The words were the words I used, but the sentences were arranged in a pattern just barely foreign to how I think. There were 6 of them, spread across 11 weeks. And they were about me. They described my moods with clinical precision: restless, withdrawn, watchful. They noted whether I'd eaten properly, whether I'd slept. They mentioned conversations we'd had, Mara and I, but from outside my perspective as observations. On a Tuesday in April it said, "She's starting to settle in," which is progress. Progress toward what? Progress for whom? I sat with those 6 entries for a long time. The handwriting, when I held pages side by side, was almost identical. Almost. The letter forms had a slightly different quality under certain letters, my lowercase g, my capital I, as if someone had studied my writing carefully enough to replicate it but could not quite reproduce the unconscious quality of it, the automation of someone writing their own hand. I thought, this is the thing that would sound most insane. This, out of everything. A person explaining that someone had broken into their home repeatedly to write in their journal in their own handwriting. I could hear how it sounded. I have very good hearing for how things sound. But I also had the photographs. I also had the plant. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and the building breathed around me, and I listened to the couple in Unit 4, and the settling of old wood and, eventually, around 2 in the morning, the familiar low sound from the apartment below. And I thought about Gerald Hess, who had smiled and said you can hear everything from the top floor. And I thought about Mara, who had a remarkable memory for things I'd mentioned once in passing. And I thought about the plant, a gift, placed on my windowsill with such apparent casualness, on the left side, which was where I'd always put plants before in my previous apartment, in the apartment before that. I had never told her that. I lay very still, and went back through our conversations, all of them the way you go back through photographs after someone is gone and look at the edges rather than the center. The things she'd remembered weren't random. They were things that would help you understand someone. The colleague's name. The book. The tea. They were the pieces you'd collect if you were building a map. If you'd been building it for some time. I thought about the journal entries. She's starting to settle in. The clinical quality of it. The patience. In the morning I got up and made coffee and looked at the pothose on the right side of the windowsill and felt, for the first time, something that had no good name. Not fear. I'd been afraid for weeks. Something underneath fear. The sensation of a room whose dimensions you've trusted suddenly revealing a door you'd always assumed was a wall. I called the only person I could think to call, my friend Daniel, who was pragmatic and unbothered and had known me long enough to have a calibrated sense of when I was rational. I told him most of it. I watched myself explain it and listened to the way it sounded and felt the familiar vertigo of not knowing which was the real question, what Mara had done, or what my mind had done. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you slept?" That is not, when you've been building toward a specific thing, you need someone to hear what you want to be asked. He came over that afternoon. He was kind about it. He's always been kind about things. He looked at the photographs and agreed the plant had moved. He read the journal entries with the care of someone trying to be fair. He held the pages up to the window and looked at the handwriting for a long time. "They're very similar," he said finally. "I know. But these letter formations here," he pointed. "Could you just have been tired? Rushed?" I said I didn't know. I said it honestly. That's the thing about this kind of doubt. It doesn't leave room for certainty even when you feel certain. Especially then. He suggested I speak to someone. A professional. He said it with the practiced gentleness of a person who'd thought about how to say it. I said I would consider it, and I did consider it, and I have still not fully decided what it would prove. He left at 7. I locked the door. I checked it twice. I moved the plant back to the left side and photographed it and set the photograph as the background of my phone. That night, I couldn't make myself stay in the bedroom. I sat in the kitchen with the light on, reading or trying to. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the staircase, the particular creak of the 3rd step from the bottom, and then nothing. No door opening. No continuing footsteps. Just the one sound, and then the building's ordinary silence. I sat very still with my book in my lap. The light in the kitchen flickered once, the way those old wiring connections sometimes do. I breathed. I want to tell you that I went and looked and found something and that it resolved the question. I want to give you the ending that would let you file this story away cleanly. But I sat in that kitchen until 3 in the morning, and then I went to bed, and when I woke the apartment was gray with early light and quiet, and the plant was on the right side of the windowsill. I had not moved it. I had the photographs to prove I had not moved it. I had locked the door. Here is what I have now, a new deadbolt. 3 months of careful documentation. A therapist who listens well and says the word dissociation in the measured tone of someone offering a hypothesis rather than a verdict. The photographs which prove something, though I've been told they don't prove what I think they prove. The journal, with its 6 foreign entries in a hand almost identical to my own. And this, a thing Mara said to me the last time we spoke, in the hallway, before I began avoiding the hallway. I had asked, almost involuntarily, I hadn't planned to ask, it came out of some need I couldn't suppress, if she'd ever felt like someone was watching her. A strange question, asked in a strange voice. She'd looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I find myself returning to that I have turned over and held to the light from every angle. She said, I think sometimes we watch ourselves without knowing it. Don't you? I've told myself she was being philosophical. I've told myself it was a coincidence, a conversational abstraction, the kind of thing thoughtful people say. I've told myself a lot of things. The therapist suggests the journal entries may be a form of dissociative writing, that under sufficient stress the self can split in ways that feel external even when they aren't. She says it carefully. She says the important thing is that I'm grounded now, present, able to distinguish. The thing is I am grounded. I know where I am. I know who I am. I know the difference between my G and the journal's G, and the difference is not mine. I moved the plant out of the kitchen. I put it in the bedroom closet. I didn't throw it away, and I've thought about why, whether there was some residual attachment to Mara, some wish for an explanation kinder than the one I'd assembled, some part of me that wanted the plant to simply be a plant. This morning I opened the closet to get a sweater. The plant was still there. Of course it was. I breathed. I took the sweater. And on the way out I noticed that the clasp on the bedroom window, which I locked 2 weeks ago and have not touched, was open. I live on the 3rd floor. There is nothing outside that window but 12 feet of air and the building's old brick face. I stood there for a moment with my sweater in my hands and felt the cold morning come in through the gap and looked at the open clasp and thought, very calmly, in the way that you think when you've passed through the far side of fear into a place without a name. I should check the photographs. I haven't yet. I'm telling you this first because I decided that someone should know before I look. Before I find out whether the image I took yesterday shows that clasp is locked, or whether it shows something I don't have an explanation for, or whether it shows something I do. Because either answer, at this point, has its own particular darkness. Either I'm wrong about the clasp, which means I can't trust my eyes. Or I'm right about the clasp, which means something else entirely, and I live on the 3rd floor, and the window is locked. I'm going to look now. I just needed you to know that I was here. That I was, for whatever it's worth, paying attention. That if things don't, that someone should know what I noticed and when and in what order. In case the shape of it matters later.